Close your eyes and let the sounds of the modern world fade away. Turn down the lights, settle into your most comfortable position, and prepare to drift back through 40,000 years of human history. Tonight, we're journeying to a time when survival wasn't guaranteed by grocery stores and central heating, but by wit, courage, and the flickering warmth of a carefully tended fire. Here at Bedtime History, the past comes alive in the gentle darkness. If you find comfort in these whispered tales from ancient times, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue exploring the shadowy corners of human history, one soothing story at a time. Tonight, we'll walk alongside our ancestors, feeling the cold bite of morning air on our skin, hearing the distant howl of wolves, and understanding what it truly meant to be human when the world was wild, dangerous, and utterly unforgiving. So breathe deeply, let your muscles relax, and allow yourself to slip backward through time to an age when every sunrise was a victory and every sunset a prayer for another dawn. Chapter 1. When Darkness Ruled the World. The world 40,000 years ago was a place of perpetual twilight, where shadows stretched longer and darkness held dominion over most of human existence. Envision, if you can, stepping into a landscape where the comfortable glow of electric lights has never existed, where the sun's departure each evening brought not the promise of television and warm dinners, but the very real possibility that you might not see another dawn. This was the world of our ancestors, the people we call cavemen, though that name barely captures the complexity of their existence. They were not the grunting, club-wielding brutes of films and stories. They were humans like us, with the same capacity for love, fear, joy, and sorrow. The same dreams haunted their sleep. The same hopes stirred their hearts. But their reality was painted in shades of survival that we can barely comprehend. Vast ice sheets stretched across continents like frozen oceans, their surfaces glinting under weak winter sunlight. Mammoth woolly beasts thundered across tundra plains, their massive feet shaking the ground, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Saber-toothed cats prowled through forests of pine and birch, their amber eyes reflecting firelight. Their presence a constant reminder that humans were not the apex predators they would one day become. The cold was not merely uncomfortable. It was a living thing, creeping through poorly insulated shelters, seeping into bones, turning breath into visible clouds that hung in the air like ghostly warnings. A fire dying in the night didn't mean grabbing another blanket from the closet. It meant the very real possibility of freezing to death before morning, of becoming another victim claimed by the merciless winter that could last for months without reprieve. Yet in this harsh world, something extraordinary was happening. Humans were not merely surviving. They were beginning to thrive. They were developing language, creating art, forming complex social bonds, and passing down knowledge that would echo through millennia. They were learning to read the subtle signs in animal tracks, to predict weather changes by the behavior of birds, to transform simple stones into tools that could mean the difference between feast and famine. Their days began before dawn, not by choice but by necessity. Sleep was a luxury that could be deadly if indulged too long. Every morning brought urgent questions. Was the fire still alive? Had predators circled their shelter during the night? Were there fresh tracks indicating nearby game, or signs of rival tribes moving through their territory? Food was never guaranteed. Unlike our world of abundant supermarkets and predictable meals, their existence was defined by cycles of plenty and scarcity. A successful hunt might mean celebration and full bellies for days, while a failed expedition could lead to hunger that gnawed at their insides, weakening them when strength was most needed. Children learned early that every berry, every root, every successful catch of fish was precious beyond modern understanding. The psychological weight of constant vigilance pressed down on them like a heavy shroud. There was no vacation from survival, no weekend break from the relentless demands of staying alive. Yet somehow, within this framework of hardship, they found moments of beauty. They painted on cave walls, creating art that would survive tens of thousands of years. They told stories around flickering fires, passing down wisdom and wonder to the next generation. They cared for their sick and elderly, proving that compassion existed even when resources were scarce. Their world was one of intimate connection, not just to each other, but to every element of their environment. They knew which plants could heal and which could kill. They understood the migration patterns of animals, the changing of seasons, the subtle signs that indicated whether a cave was safe or already occupied by something with large teeth and little patience for human intrusion. At night, when darkness swallowed the landscape completely, they huddled together around fires that served as more than sources of warmth and light. These flames were beacons of humanity itself, small victories against the vast indifference of nature. The crackling of burning wood, the dance of shadows on cave walls, the quiet murmur of voices sharing the day's experiences. These sounds created a cocoon of civilization in a world that remained fundamentally wild. As you drift deeper into relaxation, let yourself feel the weight of their existence. The constant alertness, the profound connection to the natural world, the way every decision carried the potential for life or death. Yet also feel their resilience, their ingenuity, their fierce determination to not merely exist, but to pass something meaningful to their children. In the flickering light of their fires, humanity itself was being forged, one careful day at a time. Chapter 2. How Cavemen Started Their Day. In the gray pre-dawn darkness, when the world existed in that liminal space between night and morning, consciousness returned slowly to the Stone Age human. Not with the jarring alarm of modern life, but with the gradual awareness that came from sleeping with one ear always tuned to danger. The first sensation was always cold, a creeping chill that worked its way through animal furs and into the very marrow of bones. But before stretching, before moving, before even opening eyes fully, came the listening. In that vulnerable moment between sleep and wakefulness, they strained their ears for the sounds that could mean the difference between seeing another sunset and becoming something else's breakfast. Was that the crack of a twig under a heavy paw? The rustle of something large moving through nearby brush? Or simply the wind playing through the trees, innocent and harmless? The fire was always the first priority. Rolling quietly from their sleeping furs, they moved with practiced stealth toward the heart of their shelter, where embers should still be glowing beneath a carefully constructed blanket of ash. This was the moment of truth that determined whether the day would begin with warmth and cooked food, or with the desperate, fumbling attempt to create flame from nothing while fingers grew numb with cold. Successful firebanking was an art form passed down through generations. The previous evening, someone would have selected exactly the right pieces of charcoal, arranged them just so, and covered them with precisely the right amount of ash to create insulation without smothering the precious heat. Too little ash, and the coals would burn away to nothing during the night. Too much, and they would be suffocated, leaving only cold gray dust and the prospect of a day that might never truly warm up. When the fire tender found glowing embers beneath the ash, relief flooded through them like warm honey. Gently, carefully, they would blow on the coals, watching for that first tentative flicker of flame. A handful of dry grass, a few small twigs, then larger pieces of wood. Each step was a small miracle, a daily resurrection of the force that separated them from the beast that hunted in the darkness. As flames danced to life, casting their warm glow across the shelter walls, other members of the group began to stir. But their awakening was not the leisurely process of modern mornings. Children were roused quickly but quietly, trained from their earliest years to understand that noise could attract unwanted attention. Adults moved with purpose, each person having specific responsibilities that had been honed through countless repetitions. The shelter itself had to be inspected. During the night, animals might have attempted to enter, leaving behind tracks, scent markings, or worse. A curious bear, investigating their scent, could have torn through their carefully constructed barriers. A pack of wolves might have circled, testing for weaknesses. The evidence would be there in the dirt, in disturbed vegetation, in the way the very air seemed to hold the memory of something wild and potentially dangerous. Water was the next critical need. In winter, this might mean melting snow or ice. In warmer seasons, it required a careful expedition to the nearest stream or spring, always with the awareness that water sources attracted not just humans, but every creature in the surrounding area. The person chosen for this task moved with the stealth of a hunter, reading the ground for fresh tracks, listening for the sounds that indicated whether they would be alone at the water's edge. While water was being fetched, others began the process of reading the world around them. Experienced trackers could interpret the night's events like pages in a book written in mud and disturbed vegetation. The delicate hoof prints of deer indicated possible hunting opportunities. The massive circular depressions left by mammoth feet meant the herds were moving, perhaps following seasonal migration routes that could be predicted and exploited. But not all signs were welcome. The distinctive paw prints of large cats, deep enough to show the impression of retracted claws, meant that apex predators were active in the area. The scattered remains of a kill, still fresh with a metallic scent of blood, indicated that something powerful had fed nearby during the night. Such discoveries required immediate counsel among the adults, quick decisions about whether to move to a new location or to increase their vigilance and defensive preparations. The morning meal, if there was one, was often cold food saved from the previous day's cooking. Dried meat, nuts gathered during the last foraging expedition, perhaps some stored roots or berries if the season had been kind. Eating was done efficiently, without ceremony, while eyes constantly scanned the environment and ears remained tuned to the subtle sounds that could indicate approaching danger. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the day's plans would be finalized through a combination of spoken words and hand signals. Who would hunt? Who would gather? Who would remain behind to guard the shelter and tend the fire? These decisions were based not just on individual skills, but on a complex understanding of weather patterns, animal behavior, seasonal availability of different food sources, and the current state of the group's supplies. The weapons and tools were inspected with the thoroughness of a modern surgeon examining surgical instruments. A loose spear point could mean the difference between a successful hunt and a hungry family. A cracked handle might fail at the crucial moment when a large animal was being brought down. Each tool was tested, adjusted, and prepared with the understanding that their lives might depend on its proper function. As full daylight approached, the group was ready to disperse into the dangerous world beyond their shelter. But they never left casually. Fires were banked for their return, important supplies were hidden or secured, and signals were established for emergency communication. The morning ritual was complete, but the day's true test was just beginning. Chapter 3: Tracking Mammoths and Staying Alive. The mammoth track was as large as a dinner plate, pressed deep into the soft earth beside a stream that wound through the valley like a silver ribbon. The hunter crouched beside it, his breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air as he studied the impression with the intensity of a detective examining crucial evidence. Every detail mattered. The depth, which told him the animal's size and weight. The sharpness of the edges, which revealed how recently it had passed. The way the mud had dried or remained soft, which could indicate whether they were hours or days behind their quarry. This was not the simple version of caveman hunting. A crude club-wielding brute chasing down prey, through sheer aggression. This was a chess match played out across miles of dangerous terrain, where strategy, patience, and intimate knowledge of animal behavior determined whether the hunting party would return as heroes bearing enough meat to feed the entire tribe for weeks, or whether they would return empty-handed to face the hollow eyes of hungry children. The mammoth they were tracking was old, as evidenced by the way it favored its left front foot, leaving a slightly deeper impression on that side. This was both good news and terrifying news. Good because an injured animal might be easier to bring down than a healthy adult in its prime. Terrifying because wounded animals were unpredictable, often more dangerous than their healthy counterparts, and a mammoth in pain could turn from prey to predator in a matter of seconds. The hunting party consisted of 6 men, each selected for specific skills that complemented the others. The tracker, whose eyes could read stories in disturbed grass and scatter droppings. The spearmaster, whose throwing accuracy had been honed through thousands of hours of practice until he could place a projectile exactly where he intended from distances that seemed impossible. The strategist, who understood animal psychology and could predict likely escape routes and defensive behaviors. 3 younger hunters, strong and fast, whose job was to execute the plan with perfect timing even when chaos erupted around them. They had been following this particular mammoth for 2 days, moving with the patience of shadows, never getting close enough to alert it to their presence, but never losing the trail that would lead them to their opportunity. The animal was heading toward a narrow valley where high cliffs would limit its escape routes, if they could get ahead of it and set their trap properly. The weapons they carried were marvels of Stone Age engineering, though they looked primitive to modern eyes. Spears with fire-hardened wooden points, sharpened to needle-like precision and then hardened in flames until they were almost as strong as metal. Some were tipped with carefully knapped flint points, razor-sharp edges that could slice through hide and muscle with devastating efficiency. But the real innovation was in the atlatl, a spear-throwing device that effectively doubled the length of a human arm, allowing hunters to hurl their weapons with force and accuracy that could punch through the thick hide of a mammoth. The psychological pressure on the hunters was immense. They were miles from their home base, in territory that belonged as much to saber-toothed cats and dire wolves as it did to humans. If they were injured during the hunt, if they became separated from the group, if they attracted the attention of other predators drawn by the scent of blood, they might never see their families again. Yet, this was the price of protein, the cost of survival in a world where successful hunts could mean the difference between a thriving tribe and slow starvation. As they moved closer to their intended ambush site, communication became entirely nonverbal. Hand signals developed over generations conveyed complex tactical information. A raised fist meant stop immediately and freeze. Fingers pointing in specific directions indicated the positions each hunter should take. A series of quick gestures outlined the attack sequence that would unfold in a matter of minutes, but had been planned and rehearsed for hours. The mammoth appeared at the mouth of the valley, just as the sun reached its highest point, a massive mountain of fur and muscle moving with surprising grace despite its enormous size. Its tusks, yellowed with age and scarred from countless battles, curved like ivory scimitars on either side of a trunk that could crush a human with casual ease. The beast paused, lifting its massive head to test the air for scents that might indicate danger. The hunters held their breath. They were positioned among rocks and sparse vegetation, their bodies motionless as stone, knowing that mammoths had excellent hearing and could detect the slightest movement. The animal's small eyes, seemingly disproportionate to its massive head, scanned the area where they lay hidden. For long moments that felt like hours, it remained alert and suspicious. Then, satisfied that no immediate threat existed, the mammoth began moving forward into the valley, following what it perceived to be a safe path toward water and the sweet grass that grew along the stream. It had no way of knowing that it was walking into a carefully constructed killing ground where every rock, every shadow, every possible escape route had been considered and planned for. The attack, when it came, was a symphony of precision and controlled violence. The first spear, thrown from the optimal angle to penetrate between ribs and reach vital organs, struck with a sound like thunder. The mammoth's trumpet of pain and rage echoed off the canyon walls as it spun to face its attackers. Massive feet churning the earth, tusks sweeping in deadly arcs that could impale a human like a butterfly pinned to a board. But the hunters had planned for this fury. They scattered according to their predetermined pattern, each man moving to his assigned position while additional spears flew through the air. The wounded animal, bleeding but far from finished, charged toward the nearest hunter with speed that seemed impossible for something so large. Only perfect execution of their escape plan kept all 6 men alive as the enraged mammoth smashed through the space where they had been standing moments before. The battle was not over quickly. It took time for the spears to do their work, time during which the hunters had to stay mobile, stay coordinated, and stay alive while a dying giant thrashed and charged and tried to take at least one of them to whatever mammoth afterlife awaited. When it finally fell, when a massive body settled to the earth with a sound like a landslide, the hunters stood in exhausted silence, knowing they had just accomplished something that would feed their people and secure their survival for weeks to come. But even in victory, danger remained. The scent of blood would attract every carnivore within miles. Wolves, bears, saber-toothed cats, all would come to investigate this massive carcass. The real work was just beginning. Butchering the animal, preserving the meat, and getting it back to their tribe before the scavengers arrived in force. The hunt was successful, but they were still days away from home and safety. Chapter 4: The Unsung Heroes Who Fed the Tribe. While the hunters tracked their massive prey across dangerous terrain, another group moved through the landscape with different eyes, seeking different treasures. The gatherers, predominantly women though joined by some men and older children, practiced a form of survival that required knowledge so vast and detailed it would put modern botanists to shame. They were the unsung heroes of Stone Age survival, the quiet providers who actually supplied most of the calories that kept their people alive. Dawn found them preparing for their own expedition, one that might seem less dramatic than the mammoth hunt, but was every bit as crucial and, in its own way, just as dangerous. Their tools were simpler, woven baskets, digging sticks worn smooth by countless hours of use, stone knives for cutting and scraping. But their knowledge was encyclopedic. They carried in their minds a detailed catalog of hundreds of plants, their seasonal availability, their preparation methods, and most critically, which ones could nourish and which ones could kill. The lead gatherer was an older woman whose scarred hands told stories of decades spent digging in rocky soil and handling thorny plants. Her eyes, sharp as obsidian blades, could spot edible roots at distances that amazed younger members of the group. She had survived multiple seasons of scarcity, times when the difference between life and death came down to knowing which bark could be ground into emergency flour and which berries could sustain a person through the lean days of late winter. Their first destination was a grove of oak trees, where acorns lay scattered beneath the branches like fallen treasure. But gathering acorns was far more complex than simply filling baskets with nuts. The gatherers had to sort through hundreds of fallen acorns, testing each one for the telltale holes that indicated insect infestation, checking for the subtle differences in color and weight that revealed which were ripe and which had spoiled during their fall to the forest floor. The good acorns would require days of processing before they became edible. First, they had to be cracked and shelled, a tedious process that left fingers aching and often bloodied from sharp shell fragments. Then the nut meats had to be ground in a coarse meal using stone mortars that had been carefully shaped over generations of use. But even then, the acorns were not ready to eat. They contain bitter tannins that could make a person violently ill if consumed in large quantities. The tannins had to be leached out through a process that required patience and careful timing. The ground acorn meal was placed in woven baskets and then repeatedly washed with water, with each washing removing more of the bitter compounds. The gatherers could tell by taste when the process was complete. The meal would lose its harsh bite and develop the sweet, nutty flavor that made acorns a prized food source. As they worked, they remained constantly alert for dangers that hunters rarely faced. Bears also loved acorns and might challenge humans for access to productive groves. Poisonous snakes often lurked beneath fallen logs where the best roots could be found. Some plants that looked nearly identical to nutritious species could cause agonizing death if mistaken for their edible cousins. The gatherers' knowledge extended far beyond simple nutrition. They knew which plants could be used as medicine, which could provide materials for tool making, and which had spiritual significance in their complex belief systems. They understood that the inner bark of certain trees could be woven into rope, that specific moss could be used to stop bleeding from wounds, and that some flowers, when properly prepared, could ease the pain of childbirth or help an injured person sleep through the night. Children learning the gathering arts faced an education that was literally life or death. They shadowed experienced gatherers, observing every detail of identification and preparation. They learned through repeated practice and constant correction, because a single mistake, confusing a nutritious mushroom with a deadly look-alike, for instance, could kill not just themselves but anyone who shared their mistake. The social dynamics among the gatherers were complex and often ignored by those who focused only on the more dramatic aspects of hunting. These expeditions were where much of the tribe's social bonding occurred, where knowledge was passed down, where conflicts were resolved through quiet conversation, and where the emotional bonds that held the community together were strengthened through shared work and mutual dependence. They developed intimate relationships with their environment that modern people, cushioned by grocery stores and restaurants, can barely comprehend. They knew which patches of ground would yield the sweetest roots, which riverbanks hosted the most nutritious grasses, and which hidden valleys might shelter fruit trees that could provide enough dried food to last through the winter months. The gathering expeditions could last for several days, with the group moving from location to location as different plants ripened or became available. They established temporary camps along their routes, always choosing sites that provided both access to water and defensible positions in case of trouble. At night, around smaller fires than those the hunters built, they processed their daily harvest, sharing techniques and stories that wove their individual efforts into the larger tapestry of tribal survival. Weather was always a critical factor. A sudden storm could ruin days of gathered food if it wasn't properly protected. Unseasonable frosts could destroy entire crops of wild plants that the gatherers had been counting on. They learned to read subtle signs in cloud formations, wind patterns, and animal behavior that could give them warnings about changing conditions. The return journey to their home base was often the most dangerous part of their expedition. Laden with baskets full of food, they moved more slowly and were more vulnerable to predators. The scent of fresh plant foods could attract not just herbivores, but the carnivores that hunted them. A group of gatherers, focused on protecting their precious cargo, might not notice the stalking cat or the approaching bear until it was too late to escape. Yet they persevered, these quiet heroes of Stone Age survival, because they understood that their knowledge and efforts were the foundation upon which their entire society rested. The hunters might bring home the dramatic kills that fed the tribe for days, but it was the gatherers who provided the steady, reliable nutrition that kept everyone alive between hunts. Their work was the difference between survival and extinction, pursued with dedication and skill that deserves recognition across the millennia that separate us from their careful, dangerous world. Chapter 5: Creating Shelter in a Hostile World. The cave mouth yawned before them like the entrance to another world, dark and mysterious, carrying scents of earth and moisture and something else, something that made the hair on their necks stand on end. Before any human could claim this potential sanctuary, they had to determine who or what already called a home. The process of finding shelter was never as simple as moving into an empty space. It was a delicate negotiation with nature itself, fraught with dangers that could cost them their lives. The scout approached cautiously, every sense heightened to detect the subtle signs that would reveal the cave's current occupants. Fresh scratch marks on the stone walls might indicate the presence of a bear, while the musky scent of big cats could linger for days after their departure. Scattered bones near the entrance told stories of previous meals, and the careful observer could read these remains like a diary, determining not just what had been eating here, but how recently and in what numbers. Cave bears were perhaps the most dangerous competitors for prime real estate. These massive creatures, larger than their modern descendants, had no intention of sharing their ancestral homes with presumptuous humans. The bears have been using many of these caves for generations, creating well-worn paths, sleeping depressions, and territorial markings that served as clear warnings to other creatures. A confrontation with a cave bear in the confined space of its own den was almost certainly fatal for the humans involved. Even if a cave appeared empty, claiming it required careful preparation and constant vigilance. The entrance had to be fortified without completely sealing it off. They needed escape routes if the shelter was compromised. Large stones were carefully positioned to create barriers that could slow down intruders while still allowing quick human passage. Thorn bushes were harvested and woven into painful obstacles that would discourage casual investigation by predators. The interior of a suitable cave became a carefully organized living space that would serve multiple families through the brutal winter months. Sleeping areas were established in the deepest, most protected sections, where body heat could accumulate and provide maximum warmth. Fire pits were positioned to provide light and heat while allowing smoke to escape through natural openings or artificially created vents. Storage areas for food, tools, and materials were carved into alcoves or protected by additional stone barriers. When caves were not available, the tribe had to construct shelters from whatever materials the landscape provided. These structures required intimate knowledge of engineering principles that modern architects would recognize and respect. The framework was typically built from the strongest available wood, carefully selected for flexibility and durability. Mammoths provided not just meat, but also bones that could serve as structural supports, while their thick hides became walls and roofing materials that could shed water and retain heat. The construction process was a community effort that brought together skills passed down through countless generations. Each person contributed according to their abilities. Children gathered smaller materials and helped with simple tasks, while adults handled the dangerous work of lifting heavy beams and positioning large stones. The elderly provided guidance and quality control, their experienced eyes catching potential problems before they became catastrophic failures. Insulation was achieved through layers of different materials, each serving a specific purpose. Animal furs provided the inner layer, soft against human skin and capable of trapping warm air close to the body. Beneath this might be dried grasses or mosses that created additional air pockets, while the outer layer consisted of tougher materials designed to shed rain and resist wind. The entire structure had to be flexible enough to bend with strong winds without breaking, yet solid enough to support the weight of snow accumulation. Drainage was a critical consideration that separated successful shelters from death traps. Water had to be diverted away from the living areas through carefully constructed channels and barriers. A shelter that flooded during the first heavy rain became uninhabitable, forcing the tribe to seek new accommodations in potentially hostile weather conditions. The floor of the shelter was often raised slightly above the surrounding ground level, with absorbent materials spread beneath sleeping areas to handle any moisture that did manage to seep through. Security features were built into every shelter design, reflecting the constant threat posed by both animal predators and potentially hostile human groups. Multiple exits ensured that the inhabitants could escape if the main entrance was blocked or compromised. Observation points allowed sentries to watch for approaching danger without exposing themselves to attack. Storage areas for weapons were positioned for quick access during emergencies. The psychological impact of a well-constructed shelter cannot be understated. In a world where humans were constantly exposed to the elements and the dangers they brought, having a secure, warm, dry space meant the difference between hope and despair. Children could play safely, adults could rest without constant vigilance, and the elderly could contribute their wisdom without the physical demands of constant movement. Yet even the best shelters were temporary solutions in a world of constant change. Seasonal migrations, resource depletion, or territorial conflicts with other groups meant that no home could be considered permanent. The knowledge of shelter construction had to be portable, carried in the minds and hands of the tribe members who might need to recreate their safety and comfort with entirely different materials in an unfamiliar landscape. Chapter 6: The Technology That Changed Everything. The ember glowed like a tiny sun in the cupped palms of the firekeeper, its orange heart pulsing with the rhythm of gentle breath. This single spark represented the difference between civilization and wilderness, between human dominance and animal vulnerability. Fire was not merely a tool for Stone Age people. It was the foundation upon which their entire way of life was built, a technology so revolutionary that it separated humans from every other creature on Earth. Creating fire from nothing was an art that required patience, skill, and an understanding of materials that bordered on the mystical. The firemaker would select wood with the care of a surgeon choosing instruments, knowing that the wrong choice could mean hours of futile effort and potentially fatal exposure. Dry tinder had to be gathered and prepared, sorted by how quickly it would catch and how long it would burn. The finest materials, dried grass, burred down, or shredded bark, would ignite from the smallest spark but burn away almost instantly. Medium materials would catch from these first flames and burn long enough to ignite larger fuel. Only when this carefully graded collection was assembled could the actual fire-making begin. The bow drill method required coordination that took years to master. A wooden shaft was spun rapidly against a fireboard, the friction generating heat that slowly carbonized the wood into a growing ember. The firemaker had to maintain exactly the right pressure and speed, working until wisps of smoke began to rise from the contact point. Too little pressure and no ember would form. Too much pressure and the wood would be crushed without generating sufficient heat. The rhythm had to be steady and sustained, even as muscles burned with effort and sweat threatened to blur vision. When the ember finally formed, glowing like a tiny coal in the depression of the fireboard, the most delicate part of the process began. The ember had to be transferred to the prepared tinder without extinguishing it, a task that required steady hands and controlled breathing. The tinder bundle was carefully arranged around the ember, then gently blown upon to provide the oxygen needed for combustion. Too much air would scatter the ember and destroy hours of work. Too little would allow it to die from lack of oxygen. The moment when flame finally erupted from the tinder bundle was nothing short of magical, even to people who had witnessed it thousands of times. Fire transformed everything it touched, converting raw meat into digestible nutrition, providing light that extended useful hours far beyond sunset, generating heat that could mean survival through killing cold. But fire was also dangerous, a force that could turn from servant to destroyer in moments of carelessness or misfortune. Cooking with fire was a complex science that Stone Age people understood with sophisticated precision. Different types of wood burned at different temperatures and produced different flavors. Some woods were preferred for slow roasting that would cook meat thoroughly without burning the outside. Others created hot, fast fires perfect for searing meat to lock in juices. Certain plants, when added to cooking fires, would impart flavors that made even tough, stringy meat palatable and enjoyable. The social aspects of fire extended far beyond its practical applications. The evening gathering around the communal fire was where stories were told, knowledge was passed down, conflicts were resolved, and the bonds that held the tribe together were strengthened. Children learned the history and wisdom of their people while watching flames dance and listening to voices that connected them to countless generations of ancestors. Young people found mates and formed relationships that would shape the future of the group. Fire provided protection that went beyond mere warmth and light. Most predators had an instinctive fear of flames, having learned through evolution that fire meant danger and possible death. A well-maintained fire could keep even the largest and most aggressive animals at a respectful distance, creating a zone of safety around human encampments. The smell of smoke and the sight of flames served as clear signals to other creatures that this territory was claimed by beings who possessed powers beyond the natural order. Yet fire demanded constant attention and respect. Left unattended, it could spread beyond control, consuming shelters, stored food, and even threatening the lives of those it was meant to protect. Sparks could ignite clothing or bedding, causing painful burns that might become infected in a world without modern medical care. The smoke that provided protection could also create breathing problems, especially in confined spaces where ventilation was limited. The knowledge of fire-making was considered so valuable that it was closely guarded and carefully taught. Master firemakers held positions of enormous respect within their tribes, their skills literally meaning the difference between life and death for everyone around them. Children began learning the basics of fire care as soon as they were old enough to understand the importance of the task, but true expertise took decades to develop. Fire also enabled technologies that would have been impossible without its transformative power. Tools could be hardened in flames, making wooden spear points nearly as effective as stone ones. Clay could be fired into pottery that allowed for better food storage and cooking methods. Heat could be used to shape and work materials that would have been too rigid or brittle to modify in their natural state. Chapter 7, Medicine and Healing Without Hospitals. The old woman's hands moved with practiced certainty through the collection of dried plants hanging from the cave ceiling, her fingers selecting specific leaves and roots with the precision of a modern pharmacist. In a world without hospitals, antibiotics, or surgical instruments, she was the last line of defense between her people and the countless ailments that could transform a minor injury into a death sentence. Her knowledge had been accumulated through decades of observation, experimentation, and sometimes tragic trial and error. Pain was a constant companion in Stone Age life, arising from injuries that occurred during hunting, gathering, or simply navigating a world filled with sharp rocks, thorny plants, and unpredictable animals. A twisted ankle could leave someone unable to contribute to the tribe's survival efforts. A deep cut from a stone tool could become infected, spreading poison through the body until even the strongest warrior was reduced to helpless suffering. The healer's understanding of plant medicine was often the only thing standing between such injuries and death. Willow bark, when properly prepared, contained compounds that could reduce pain and inflammation. The healer knew exactly when to harvest it for maximum potency, how to prepare it so the active ingredients were released without destroying them, and what dosages were appropriate for different ages and conditions. Too little would provide no relief, while too much could cause stomach problems that might weaken an already suffering patient. Wounds required immediate and expert attention to prevent the corruption that could spread through the body like wildfire. Honey, when available, was applied to cuts and scrapes for its ability to prevent infection and promote healing. Certain mosses could absorb blood and help wounds clot, while specific plant extracts could numb pain long enough for more serious treatments to be applied. The healer had to work quickly and decisively, knowing that delay could mean the difference between recovery and death. Broken bones presented challenges that tested the limits of Stone Age medical knowledge. Without x-rays or modern surgical techniques, the healer had to rely on touch, observation, and instinct to determine the extent of damage and the best course of treatment. Splints were fashioned from straight branches and bound with plant fibers or leather strips. The patient had to endure weeks of immobilization while the bone healed, dependent on others for food, water, and basic care. Childbirth in the Stone Age was a perilous event that claimed the lives of many mothers and babies. The healer's knowledge of herbal remedies that could ease labor pains, stimulate contractions, or stop excessive bleeding was crucial for tribal survival. Certain plants could help with milk production for nursing mothers, while others could prevent infections that commonly occurred after delivery. The spiritual and emotional support provided by experienced healers was often as important as their medical knowledge. Digestive problems were common in a world where food safety depended entirely on human judgment, and where starvation sometimes forced people to eat things that might not be entirely wholesome. The healer knew which plants could settle upset stomachs, relieve constipation, or help the body expel poisons that had been accidentally consumed. Some remedies required careful preparation to be effective, while others worked best when used in specific combinations. Mental and emotional healing was recognized as being just as important as treatment for physical ailments. The trauma of losing family members to predators, accidents, or disease could leave survivors unable to function effectively within the tribe. Certain plants had calming properties that could help people sleep despite their grief or anxiety. Rituals and ceremonies provided structure and meaning that helped individuals process their pain and reconnect with their community. The healer's role extended beyond treating illness and injury to preventing problems before they occurred. Knowledge of which foods provided essential nutrients, which activities were most likely to cause injury, and which environmental conditions pose health risks was shared with the entire tribe. This preventive approach was crucial in a world where treatment options were limited and recovery from serious illness was never guaranteed. Respiratory problems were particularly dangerous in the cold, damp conditions that often characterized Stone Age living situations. The healer knew which herb could be burned to create healing smoke that would ease congested lungs and clear breathing passages. Steam treatments using heated stones and aromatic plants could provide relief from chest congestion and help prevent minor respiratory issues from developing into life-threatening conditions. The psychological burden carried by the healer was enormous. Success brought gratitude and respect, but failure could result in exile or even death if the tribe believed incompetence or malicious intent was involved. Every decision had to be made with limited information and primitive tools, yet the consequences were often matters of life and death for people the healer had known and cared about since childhood. Chapter 8. Raising Children in the Stone Age. The infant's cry pierced the quiet dawn like a fragile bird call, carrying across the camp and stirring protective instincts in every adult within hearing. In the Stone Age world, where death stalked children with relentless persistence, that sound represented both hope and vulnerability, a new life that would need years of constant protection before it could contribute to the tribe's survival rather than consuming its precious resources. Childhood in this harsh environment was not the protected, playful period that modern societies attempt to provide. From their earliest moments, children were participants in a desperate struggle for survival, their education beginning with lessons that could determine whether they lived to see their next birthday. A child who could not learn quickly, adapt constantly, and contribute meaningfully to the group's efforts was unlikely to survive the brutal selection pressure of Stone Age existence. Mothers carried their infants constantly during the first months of life, knowing that separation could mean death from exposure, predation, or simple neglect. The baby's cries could attract unwanted attention from predators, so mothers learned techniques for keeping their children calm and quiet during dangerous situations. Feeding schedules were determined not by the child's hunger, but by the tribe's safety, with mothers sometimes forced to suppress their baby's natural needs to avoid detection by hostile forces. As soon as children could walk steadily, they began contributing to the tribe's survival efforts through carefully supervised tasks that matched their developing abilities. 3-year-olds could gather small kindling for fires, their tiny hands perfect for collecting the fine twigs and dry grass that were essential for starting flames. 4-year-olds could help sort edible plants from poisonous ones, their education in botanical identification beginning with the most critical distinctions between life and death. Play was never separate from learning in Stone Age childhood. Games that looked like simple entertainment were actually sophisticated training programs that developed the skills children would need as adults. Wrestling matches taught fighting techniques that might save their lives during predator attacks. Throwing contests with small stones developed the accuracy and strength necessary for hunting. Hide-and-seek games trained children in stealth and observation skills that could determine whether they became hunters or prey. The transition from childhood to adolescence was marked by increasingly dangerous responsibilities and challenges that tested both physical capabilities and mental toughness. Young people were expected to participate in hunting expeditions, initially as observers and assistants, but gradually taking on more active roles as their skills developed. A teenager who could not keep up with the group during long tracking expeditions, or who panicked during encounters with dangerous animals, would be unlikely to survive to adulthood. Language acquisition was a matter of survival rather than simple communication. Children had to learn not just the spoken language of their tribe, but also the complex system of hand signals used during hunts, the subtle body language that indicated emotional states and potential conflicts, and the specialized vocabulary needed to discuss technical aspects of tool-making, plant identification, and animal behavior. A child who could not communicate effectively was dangerous to the entire group. Coming-of-age rituals served multiple purposes beyond simple ceremony. They tested young people's physical endurance, mental toughness, and technical skills under controlled but genuinely dangerous conditions. These trials eliminated individuals who were not ready for adult responsibilities while providing clear markers of achievement for those who succeeded. The psychological impact of surviving such challenges built confidence and group identity that strengthened tribal bonds. Death was a constant presence in Stone Age childhood, shaping young minds and hearts in ways that modern children cannot comprehend. Many children witnessed the violent deaths of family members during predator attacks or hunting accidents. Others experienced the slow agony of watching loved ones die from diseases or injuries that could not be treated effectively. Learning to cope with grief and loss while continuing to function within the group was an essential survival skill. Discipline in Stone Age child rearing was swift and decisive, reflecting the reality that mistakes could have fatal consequences. A child who wandered away from the group during travel, who made noise during dangerous situations, or who failed to follow safety protocols would be corrected immediately and memorably. The luxury of patience and gentle guidance was not available when a single error could doom the entire tribe. Educational methods relied heavily on storytelling, with elders using dramatic narratives to teach essential survival information in memorable formats. Stories about children who ignored warnings and were killed by predators served as cautionary tales that conveyed safety information more effectively than simple rules. Tales of successful hunts, wise decisions, and heroic sacrifices provided positive models for behavior while entertaining listeners during long winter nights. The emotional bonds between Stone-Age children and their caregivers were intensely strong, forged by shared dangers and mutual dependence. Children who lost their parents faced uncertain futures that depended entirely on the willingness of other tribe members to accept additional burdens. The decision to take responsibility for orphan children was never made lightly, as it meant dividing already scarce resources and attention among additional dependents who might not survive despite the sacrifice. Chapter 9: Tribal Politics and Relationships. In the flickering shadows cast by the evening fire, human nature revealed itself in ways both tender and brutal. The Stone Age tribe was not simply a collection of individuals struggling against nature. It was a complex web of relationships, alliances, jealousies, and bonds that could determine who lived through the harsh winter and who did not. Leadership emerged not from birthright or violence, but from the quiet accumulation of respect earned through countless small acts of wisdom, courage, and sacrifice. The eldest hunter carried scars that told stories of successful hunts and narrow escapes. His graying hair spoke of winters survived, children raised, and decisions made when the tribe balanced on the knife's edge between survival and extinction. Yet his authority was not absolute. It flowed and ebbed like water, dependent on his continued ability to make sound judgments and maintain the delicate balance between competing interests within the group. When conflicts arose, and they always arose, resolution required skills that modern diplomats would recognize and admire. A dispute over the distribution of meat from a successful hunt could fracture relationships that had taken years to build. The perceived favoritism shown to one family over another could create resentments that festered like infected wounds, poisoning the cooperation essential for group survival. The leader's role was to find solutions that preserved essential relationships while maintaining fairness and preventing violence. Mating relationships carried implications far beyond personal happiness or romantic fulfillment. When a young man sought to claim a particular woman as his partner, he was not simply expressing desire. He was proposing an alliance between families that would affect resource sharing, mutual protection, and the allocation of responsibilities for years to come. The woman's family evaluated not just the suitor's hunting skills or physical strength, but his temperament, his likelihood of surviving to provide for children, and his potential value as an ally during times of crisis. The courtship process itself was a careful dance that balanced individual choice with group needs. A woman who rejected all potential partners created problems for the tribe's long-term survival, while a man who pursued unsuitable relationships could destabilize existing alliances. Community pressure guided these decisions through subtle social cues, storytelling that emphasized certain values, and the gradual isolation of individuals whose choices threatened group harmony. Trade relationships with neighboring tribes required diplomatic skills that would challenge modern negotiators. The exchange of goods, flint tools for animal hides, specialized weapons for rare medicinal plants, created bonds that could mean the difference between survival and extinction during particularly harsh periods. But these relationships also carried risks. Trading partners could become competitors for hunting grounds, or allies could transform into enemies if resources became scarce enough to break even the strongest agreements. Children learn social dynamics through careful observation and gradual participation in group decision-making processes. They watched as their elders navigated complex situations where a wrong word or misinterpreted gesture could lead to exile or violence. Young people absorbed lessons about reading facial expressions, understanding the subtle meanings behind apparently casual comments, and recognizing the warning signs that indicated rising tensions within the group. The elderly held special positions within tribal politics, their accumulated wisdom balanced against their declining ability to contribute physically to group survival. A grandmother who could no longer gather food or help with heavy work might still possess knowledge about plant medicines, weather patterns, or the location of emergency food sources that could save lives during desperate times. The tribe's treatment of its elderly members reflected both practical considerations and deeply held beliefs about honor, loyalty, and the value of human life. Territorial disputes with other tribes could escalate from minor incidents into conflicts that threatened everyone's survival. When hunting grounds overlapped, when water sources became contested, or when population pressure forced groups into closer contact, the potential for violence increased dramatically. Leaders had to decide when to fight, when to negotiate, and when to simply move to new territory, choices that could determine whether their people prospered or perished. Justice within the tribe operated through systems that balanced individual accountability with group survival needs. A person who stole food during times of scarcity faced consequences that could range from public shame to exile, depending on the severity of the offense and the circumstances surrounding it. But punishment was never simply retribution. It served to reinforce group values, deter future violations, and maintain the social bonds essential for survival. The psychological pressures of constant interdependence created stress that had to be managed through carefully developed social mechanisms. Humor, storytelling, ritual celebrations, and shared work all serve to release tensions that might otherwise explode into destructive conflicts. The tribe's emotional health was just as important as its physical survival, and maintaining group morale required constant attention and skilled leadership. Chapter 10: The Birth of Human Creativity. Deep within the cave, where darkness pressed against the flickering torch flames like a living thing, the artist worked with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the intensity of creation. The ochre pigment, mixed with animal fat and spit, flowed across the stone wall in lines that captured something beyond mere representation. They held the essence of life itself, frozen in time, yet somehow still breathing with the movement and power of the great beast that thundered across the world outside. Cave painting was far more than decoration or idle artistic expression. These images served as maps that could guide hunters to water sources and seasonal grazing areas. They functioned as historical records that preserved knowledge about animal behavior, migration patterns, and successful hunting techniques. They operated as spiritual touchstones that connected the living to the spirits of the animals they hunted and the ancestors who had walked these paths before them. The creation of pigments required knowledge that bordered on chemistry. Red ochre was gathered from specific rock formations and ground into powder using stone mortars that had been shaped through countless hours of patient work. Yellow and brown tones came from different mineral sources, each requiring particular preparation methods to achieve the desired color and consistency. Black was often created from charcoal, carefully selected from woods that burned to the right shade and texture. Brushes were fashioned from whatever materials the environment provided. Hollow bird bones became paint containers and applicators. Animal hair was bound together to create tools that could produce fine lines or broad washes of color. Sometimes artists used their own fingers, hands, or even mouths to apply paint, creating textures and effects that could not be achieved through other methods. The human hand itself became part of the artistic process, with handprints serving as signatures, territorial markers, or spiritual symbols. Music filled the caves and camps with sounds that connected human souls to something larger than their daily struggle for survival. Flutes carved from the winged bones of great birds produced haunting melodies that could carry for miles across the landscape. Drums stretched with hide and beaten with sticks created rhythms that synchronized heartbeats and coordinated group activities. The human voice, perhaps the most sophisticated instrument of all, wove stories and songs that preserved cultural knowledge and emotional wisdom. The construction of musical instruments demanded technical skills that rivaled those needed for making hunting tools. Bone flutes required precise drilling to create holes that would produce the desired pitches. The spacing and size of these holes had to be calculated through trial and error, with musicians developing an understanding of acoustics that was both intuitive and remarkably sophisticated. Drums needed the right combination of frame materials and high tension to produce sounds that were both loud enough for communication and pleasant enough for extended listening. Storytelling around the evening fire served multiple functions that went far beyond entertainment. Narratives about successful hunts preserved tactical knowledge that could be applied to future expeditions. Tales of failed expeditions warned against specific mistakes and dangerous situations. Stories about the behavior of animals, the changing of seasons, and the location of resources created a shared database of survival information that could be accessed through memory and repetition. Body decoration and personal ornamentation reflected social status, tribal affiliation, and individual identity in ways that could be read and understood by members of the community. Certain patterns or colors might indicate hunting achievements, spiritual roles, or family relationships. The materials used for decoration, rare stones, unusual shells, or difficult-to-obtain pigments, demonstrated access to trade networks and the respect of other tribe members. The spiritual dimensions of Stone Age art connected human creativity to beliefs about the nature of reality and humanity's place within the natural world. Images of animals were not simply representations, but were believed to contain something of the creature's spiritual essence. Creating these images was often part of rituals designed to ensure hunting success, appease animal spirits, or maintain the cosmic balance between human needs and natural forces. Dance and movement complemented visual and musical arts in creating comprehensive cultural expressions that engage the entire community. Ritual dances might reenact successful hunts, celebrate seasonal changes, or honor the spirits of deceased tribe members. These physical performances required coordination, stamina, and artistic sensitivity that transformed practical knowledge into beautiful and meaningful cultural experiences. The preservation and transmission of artistic knowledge faced constant challenges in a world without written language or permanent settlements. Master artists had to train apprentices through direct observation and hands-on practice. Techniques for creating pigments, crafting instruments, and executing complex visual compositions had to be memorized and passed down through generations of practitioners who might never see their own work survive beyond their lifetimes. Chapter 11: Stone Age Innovation and Engineering. The sharp crack of stone against stone echoed through the morning air like a gunshot, followed by the subtle whisper of flakes falling to the ground. The toolmaker sat cross-legged beside the fire, his weathered hands moving with the precision of a surgeon as he shaped a piece of flint into an instrument that could mean the difference between feast and famine. Each strike was calculated, each angle carefully considered, each movement the result of knowledge accumulated through decades of practice and countless failures. Stone tool making was an art that demanded understanding of materials science, physics, and engineering principles that modern manufacturers would recognize and respect. Different types of stone possessed varying qualities that determined their suitability for specific purposes. Flint, obsidian, and chert could be knapped into sharp edges that rivaled the sharpness of modern surgical instruments. Harder stones like granite and basalt were better suited for hammers, grinding tools, and weapons that needed to withstand heavy impact. The process of creating a sophisticated tool began long before the actual knapping commenced. The craftsman had to select raw materials that were free from internal flaws that could cause catastrophic failures during use. A spear point that shattered at the moment of impact, a cutting edge that chipped during crucial food preparation, or a scraping tool that broke while processing hides could spell disaster for individuals and their families. Hafting techniques that attached stone blades to wooden handles required engineering solutions that would challenge modern designers. The connection had to be strong enough to withstand repeated impacts, flexible enough to absorb shock without breaking, and reliable enough to function in life or death situations. Sinew, plant fibers, and adhesives made from tree resins were combined in complex assemblies that distributed stress across multiple components. Specialized tools emerged to meet specific needs that arose from the Stone Age lifestyle. Needle-like implements carved from bone allowed for the creation of fitted clothing that provided superior protection against cold and weather. Fishhooks shaped from bone or carved would enable the exploitation of aquatic food sources that would otherwise remain inaccessible. Cutting tools designed for specific purposes, skinning knives, plant processors, wood shapers, reflected deep understanding of the mechanical requirements for different tasks. The creation of composite tools represented advanced engineering thinking that combined multiple materials to achieve performance characteristics that no single substance could provide. Spear points were not simply sharp stones attached to sticks, but carefully designed systems that balanced penetration, durability, and ease of repair. The stone point provided the cutting edge. The wooden shaft supplied flexibility and length, and the binding materials held everything together while allowing for controlled failure that protected the more valuable components. Quality control in Stone Age toolmaking was a matter of survival rather than simple craftsmanship. Every tool had to be tested under conditions that simulated actual use, with failures identified and corrected before the implements were needed in critical situations. A hunting party that discovered defective equipment while tracking dangerous prey might not survive to return home and report the problems. Innovation in tool design was driven by the constant pressure to improve efficiency and effectiveness in all aspects of survival-related activities. Improvements in hunting weapons increased the likelihood of successful kills while reducing the risks faced by hunters. Better food processing tools allowed for more efficient use of available resources and reduced waste that could mean starvation during lean periods. Enhanced clothing and shelter construction tools improved protection against environmental hazards. The social aspects of tool making created networks of knowledge, sharing, and specialization that strengthened tribal bonds while improving overall technological capabilities. Master craftsmen trained apprentices in techniques that had been refined over generations, while also learning about innovations and improvements developed by other practitioners. The exchange of tools and technical knowledge with neighboring tribes facilitated the spread of beneficial technologies across wide geographic areas. Maintenance and repair of existing tools was often more important than creating new ones, given the time and effort required for manufacture and the scarcity of suitable raw materials. Stone tools could be resharpened multiple times before they became too small or fragile for continued use. Wooden handles could be replaced when they cracked or broke, extending the useful life of expensive stone components. The ability to maintain and repair equipment was an essential skill that every adult member of the tribe needed to master. Raw material acquisition sometimes required expeditions that carried significant risks and consumed valuable time and energy. High-quality stone for tool making was not available everywhere, forcing tribes to travel long distances to quarries where suitable materials could be obtained. These journeys took hunters and gatherers away from food procurement activities and exposed them to territorial conflicts with other groups who claimed the same resources. Chapter 12: Surviving Ice Ages and Climate Chaos. The wind howled across the frozen landscape like the voice of death itself, carrying ice crystals that cut exposed skin like tiny knives and promising temperatures that could freeze a human solid in a matter of hours. The world had entered another cycle of the great cooling, when glaciers advanced like slow-moving mountains of ice, crushing everything in their path and transforming familiar landscapes into alien wastelands where survival required skills and knowledge that pushed human adaptability to its absolute limits. Ice ages were not distant, abstract climate events for Stone Age people. They were personal, immediate, and deadly realities that shaped every aspect of daily life. The advancing cold killed plants, drove away animals, and transformed reliable water sources into frozen monuments that mocked human thirst. Tribes that had thrived in temperate conditions found themselves facing starvation, exposure, and extinction as their world literally froze around them. Migration became a survival strategy that required complex planning and enormous risks. Entire communities had to abandon ancestral territories and move toward regions where life might still be possible. These journeys covered hundreds of miles across terrain that grew more hostile with each passing season. Families carried everything they owned on their backs, knowing that leaving something behind might mean death later when that item was desperately needed. The psychological challenges of living through an ice age tested human mental resilience in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. The gradual realization that the cold was not temporary, that the summer warmth might never return, that children might grow up in a world of permanent winter. These thoughts pressed down on human consciousness like physical weight. Depression, despair, and madness claimed victims just as surely as freezing temperatures and starvation. Clothing technology advanced rapidly under the pressure of extreme cold, with innovations that would not be seen again until modern polar exploration equipment was developed. Multiple layers of fur and hide were arranged in complex systems that trapped warm air while allowing moisture to escape. Tight-fitting inner garments hugged the body to retain heat, while looser outer layers provided protection against wind and snow. Headwear, footwear, and hand coverings were designed with understanding of heat loss patterns that reflected sophisticated knowledge of human physiology. Food storage became critical for survival during months when fresh food was completely unavailable. Meat had to be preserved through smoking, drying, and freezing techniques that prevented spoilage while maintaining nutritional value. Fat, which burned efficiently in the human body and provided essential calories for maintaining body temperature, was carefully saved and rationed. Underground storage pits, protected from scavengers and temperature fluctuations, became lifelines that could mean the difference between surviving until spring and perishing in the depths of winter. Shelter construction required engineering solutions that could withstand the extreme conditions imposed by Ice Age weather. Structures had to shed snow loads that could collapse roofs and walls. They needed insulation systems that could maintain livable interior temperatures even when outside air was cold enough to kill exposed humans in minutes. Ventilation had to be carefully controlled to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning from heating fires while avoiding heat loss that could be fatal. The social dynamics within groups changed dramatically under the stress of extreme survival conditions. Resources that had once been shared freely became precious commodities that required careful allocation. Decisions about who received the warmest clothing, the largest food portions, or the safest sleeping positions could determine who lived through the winter and who did not. Leaders faced impossible choices that tested their wisdom, compassion, and authority. Communication with other tribes became both more important and more difficult during Ice Age conditions. Groups needed to share information about food sources, safe routes, and changing conditions, but travel between communities became extremely dangerous. Signals using smoke or reflected light could carry messages across long distances, but required clear weather and established codes that both sender and receiver understood. Fuel for fires became a limiting factor that determined where groups could survive and for how long. Trees became scarce as forests died and were consumed for heating and cooking. Alternative fuel sources, dried animal dung, fat-soaked materials, even human waste, had to be collected and carefully conserved. The search for burnable materials took people away from other survival activities and exposed them to additional risks from weather and predators. Weather prediction skills developed by Ice Age survivors would impress modern meteorologists with their accuracy and sophistication. The ability to read subtle signs in cloud formations, wind patterns, and animal behavior could provide warnings about approaching storms that might last for days or weeks. Groups that could predict weather changes had significant advantages in planning travel, hunting expeditions, and resource gathering activities. The end of ice ages brought new challenges that were almost as difficult as the cold periods themselves. As temperatures rose and ice melted, flooding destroyed settlements and forced new migrations. Animals and plants that had adapted to cold conditions died off, while new species moved in to fill empty ecological niches. Humans had to adapt once again, developing new tools, techniques, and survival strategies for a world that was transforming around them faster than they could adjust to the changes. Chapter 13: The Development of Language and Communication. In the gentle twilight hours when the day's survival tasks were complete and families gathered around flickering fires, something profound was happening in the human throat and mind. Sounds that had once been simple grunts and calls were evolving into complex patterns of meaning, creating the foundation for language that would eventually carry poetry, philosophy, and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. The development of human speech was not a sudden miracle, but a gradual transformation that took place over thousands of years, shaped by necessity and refined through constant use. The earliest forms of communication relied heavily on gestures, facial expressions, and simple vocalizations that could convey immediate needs and basic emotions. A raised hand meant stop, a pointed finger indicated direction, and the tilt of a head could signal curiosity or confusion. These physical forms of communication remained important even as spoken language developed, creating a rich multimodal system that allowed for precise and nuanced expression of complex ideas. The survival advantage of clear communication was enormous. Groups that could coordinate effectively were more likely to succeed in hunts, avoid dangers, and share critical knowledge about food sources and environmental hazards. The anatomical changes that enabled speech were themselves evolutionary adaptations to the demands of Stone Age life. The human larynx gradually descended in the throat, creating a longer vocal tract that could produce a wider range of sounds. The tongue became more flexible and muscular, capable of the precise movements needed to create distinct phonemes. The brain developed specialized regions for language processing, with areas dedicated to grammar, vocabulary, and the complex coordination required for fluent speech. These changes came with costs. The lowered larynx made humans more vulnerable to choking, while the enlarged brain required longer periods of infant dependency. Hunting required sophisticated communication methods that could function silently when stealth was essential for survival. Hand signals developed into elaborate systems that could convey detailed tactical information across distances where whispered words might alert prey or predators. A series of quick gestures could communicate the size of a tracking group, the direction of animal movement, the presence of obstacles or dangers, and the timing for coordinated attacks. These silent languages were as complex and grammatically structured as any spoken tongue, with subtle variations in hand positions and movement patterns conveying precise meanings that could mean the difference between successful hunting and starvation. The sounds that would eventually become words emerged from the practical needs of daily life. Specific calls developed to warn of different types of danger. The sharp bark that indicated approaching predators differed from a sustained howl that signaled immediate threat to the group. Different vocalizations evolved to coordinate group activities, celebrate successful hunts, mourn the dead, and maintain contact between separated individuals during travel or foraging expeditions. Each sound carried emotional weight as well as practical information, helping to bond communities together through shared understanding of meaning and purpose. The development of vocal calls for different situations required sophisticated understanding of acoustic properties and environmental factors. Calls used for long-distance communication had to be loud enough to carry across vast landscapes, while remaining distinct from natural sounds that might mask their meaning. Warning calls needed to be immediately recognizable and attention-grabbing, while signals used during hunting had to be subtle enough to avoid alerting prey. The acoustic environment of different landscapes influenced the development of local communication patterns, with groups living in forests developing different vocal strategies than those inhabiting open grasslands. Children learn language through immersion in a world where communication was literally a matter of life and death. They absorbed not just vocabulary and grammar, but also the subtle cues that indicated when speech was appropriate and when silence was required for survival. Young people who could not master these communication skills quickly became liabilities that endangered the entire group, creating intense pressure for rapid and accurate language acquisition. The learning process was accelerated by the constant need to understand instructions about safety, food preparation, tool use, and social relationships that govern daily existence. Regional dialects began to emerge as groups became isolated by geographic barriers or territorial boundaries. Tribes separated by mountain ranges or river systems developed distinct pronunciation patterns, specialized vocabularies for local resources and conditions, and unique grammatical structures that reflected their particular ways of understanding and organizing the world around them. These linguistic differences could serve as tribal identification markers that distinguished friends from potential enemies, while also preserving specialized knowledge about local environments that was crucial for survival in specific regions. The transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next relied heavily on oral traditions that preserved essential survival information in memorable formats. Stories about successful hunting techniques, dangerous situations to avoid, and seasonal patterns of resource availability were encoded in narratives that could be accurately repeated and passed down through countless retellings. The rhythm, repetition, and emotional content of these stories made them easier to remember than simple lists of facts, while also providing entertainment during long winter nights when other activities were limited by darkness and cold. Abstract concepts gradually entered human language as cognitive abilities developed and social structures became more complex. Words for concepts like justice, honor, friendship, and loyalty emerged to describe the social bonds and ethical systems that held groups together during times of stress and scarcity. The ability to discuss these abstract ideas through language allowed for more sophisticated forms of social organization and conflict resolution, enabling groups to solve problems through discussion rather than violence. This linguistic evolution reflected growing psychological complexity as humans developed greater self-awareness and understanding of their relationships with others. Emotional expression through language provided outlets for the psychological stresses that accumulated during the constant struggle for survival. The ability to verbalize fear, grief, anger, and joy allowed individuals to process traumatic experiences and maintain mental health in circumstances that might otherwise lead to breakdown and dysfunction. Shared emotional expression through group singing, chanting, or storytelling strengthened social bonds and provided comfort during difficult times, creating psychological resilience that was essential for surviving the harsh realities of Stone Age existence. Technical vocabulary evolved to describe the tools, techniques, and materials that were essential for survival. Precise terminology for different types of stone, specific methods of tool construction, and detailed descriptions of animal behavior allowed for accurate transmission of technical knowledge from experts to apprentices. This specialized language ensured that critical survival skills could be preserved and improved over time rather than being lost with the death of individual practitioners. The development of technical language also facilitated innovation by allowing builders and crafters to discuss modifications and improvements to existing designs. Music and rhythm became integrated with language development, creating combinations of sound, meaning, and emotion that were more powerful and memorable than speech alone. Songs that incorporated important survival information could be remembered more accurately and for longer periods than simple spoken instructions. The musical elements of early language may have provided the foundation for the complex tonal and rhythmic patterns that characterize modern human speech, while also serving as a form of cultural expression that strengthened group identity and provided psychological comfort during difficult periods. The neurological changes that enabled complex language development also enhanced other cognitive abilities that proved crucial for survival. The same brain structures that process grammatical relationships also improved spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and abstract thinking. Language development, therefore, represented not just an improvement in communication, but a fundamental enhancement of human intelligence that provided advantages in tool-making, environmental adaptation, and social organization. These cognitive improvements created positive feedback loops that accelerated both linguistic and technological development, setting the stage for the remarkable cultural achievements that would follow in later periods of human history. Chapter 14: Stone Age Religion and Beliefs. In the deepest chambers of the cave, where darkness was so complete it seemed to have physical weight, the shaman prepared for the ritual that would guide the spirits of the recently departed to their final rest. The flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows on walls painted with mysterious symbols, creating an atmosphere where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead seemed thin and permeable. Death was not an ending for Stone Age people. It was a transformation that required careful guidance and proper ceremonies to ensure the safety of both the deceased and those they left behind. The development of religious consciousness marked a fundamental shift in human psychological evolution, reflecting sophisticated cognitive abilities that distinguished humans from other species. The capacity to contemplate existence beyond immediate sensory experience, to envision continued consciousness after physical death, and to develop complex explanatory systems for natural phenomena required abstract thinking abilities that were uniquely human. These cognitive developments enabled Stone Age people to create meaning systems that provided psychological comfort and social cohesion in the face of uncertainty and mortality. Burial practices revealed sophisticated beliefs about the nature of human existence and the relationship between physical and spiritual reality. Bodies were not simply disposed of as organic waste, but were carefully prepared and positioned according to complex rituals that reflected deep thought about consciousness, identity, and the possibility of continued existence after physical death. The inclusion of tools, ornaments, and food in burial sites suggested belief in an afterlife where the deceased would need these items for their continued journey. Some burials included weapons and hunting gear, indicating beliefs about continued activities beyond death, while others featured jewelry and personal items that suggested concerns about identity and recognition in the spiritual realm. The positioning of bodies in burial sites often followed specific patterns that aligned with celestial events or geographic features that held spiritual significance. Some individuals were buried facing toward the rising sun, suggesting beliefs about rebirth or renewal associated with daily solar cycles. Others were oriented toward particular mountains, rivers, or other landscape features that may have been considered sacred or spiritually powerful. The careful attention to burial orientation indicates sophisticated astronomical knowledge and suggests that Stone Age people understood connections between terrestrial and celestial phenomena that influenced their spiritual worldview. Animal spirits played central roles in Stone Age religious systems, reflecting the intimate relationship between human survival and the natural world. The animals that provided food, clothing, and tools were not seen as mere resources, but as conscious beings with their own spiritual essence and power. Successful hunting required not just technical skill, but also spiritual preparation that acknowledged the sacrifice of the animal and expressed gratitude for its gift of life. Hunting rituals often included ceremonies designed to appease animal spirits and ensure their cooperation in future hunts, while also providing psychological preparation for the dangerous work of tracking and killing large prey. The spiritual relationship between humans and animals was expressed through elaborate cave paintings and carved objects that depicted hunting scenes, animal figures, and hybrid creatures that combined human and animal characteristics. These artistic representations suggest that Stone Age people believed in spiritual connections between human and animal consciousness, possibly including beliefs about shape-shifting, animal guides, or totemic relationships between specific animals and human groups. The careful attention to anatomical detail in animal art indicates intimate knowledge of animal behavior and biology that went beyond simple observation to include spiritual understanding. Rituals before hunting expeditions served multiple psychological and social functions beyond their obvious spiritual purposes. These ceremonies help hunters focus their attention, build group cohesion, and manage the anxiety that naturally arose before dangerous activities. The shared participation in ritual activities created bonds between group members that strengthened cooperation and mutual support during challenging hunts. The psychological benefits of ritual preparation may have been as important as the spiritual aspects, providing confidence and mental clarity that improve hunting success rates and reduce the risk of accidents during dangerous pursuits. Shamanic practices developed around individuals who demonstrated special abilities to communicate with spiritual forces and mediate between the human and non-human worlds. These spiritual specialists often combined religious functions with practical roles as healers, counselors, and keepers of cultural knowledge. Their authority derived not from political power, but from their perceived ability to access sources of wisdom and guidance that were unavailable to ordinary individuals. Shamans often underwent intensive training that included periods of isolation, fasting, and exposure to extreme conditions that altered consciousness and enhanced their perceived spiritual abilities. The interpretation of dreams and visions provided guidance for decision-making in a world where the consequences of poor choices could be fatal. Individuals who experienced particularly vivid or meaningful dreams were often consulted before important group decisions were made. The content of dreams was believed to contain warnings about future dangers, advice about resource locations, or messages from deceased ancestors who continued to care for their living descendants. Dream interpretation became a specialized skill that required understanding of symbolic language and cultural metaphors that connected mundane experiences to spiritual insights. Sacred sites in the landscape became focal points for religious activities and cultural identity. Certain caves, rock formations, springs, or groves were designated as spiritually significant locations where important rituals were performed and spiritual forces were believed to be particularly active. These sites often became gathering places for multiple tribes, creating opportunities for trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchange that strengthened regional networks and facilitated the spread of beneficial innovations. The designation of sacred sites also helped establish territorial boundaries and provided neutral ground where potentially hostile groups could meet safely. Seasonal festivals and ceremonies marked important transitions in a natural cycle and provided structure for community life during long periods when survival activities dominated daily existence. Celebrations of solstices, equinoxes, and other astronomical events connected human communities to cosmic rhythms and provided opportunities for rest, socialization, and cultural transmission that strengthened group bonds. These festivals often included elaborate preparations that required cooperation from all community members, reinforcing social relationships while providing relief from the constant pressure of survival activities. The creation myths and origin stories told around evening fires served multiple functions beyond entertainment or religious instruction. These narratives provided explanations for natural phenomena, established cultural values and behavioral norms, and created shared identity among group members. The repeated telling of these stories during community gatherings reinforced social cohesion and transmitted important cultural information to younger generations, while also providing frameworks for understanding human relationships with the natural world and other communities. Ancestor veneration created links between the living and the dead that provided psychological comfort and practical guidance for decision-making. The wisdom and experience of deceased elders was preserved through stories and rituals that kept their memory alive and their influence active in community affairs. This connection to ancestral knowledge provided stability and continuity in a world where change and uncertainty were constant threats, while also establishing moral authority for community leaders who claim to speak for revered ancestors. Chapter 15, Facing Extinction and Change. The great mammoth lay motionless in a muddy clearing, its massive tusks gleaming dully in the weak morning sunlight. But this was not the triumphant end of a successful hunt. This ancient giant had simply collapsed and died, one of countless megafauna that were disappearing from the world as climates shifted and the very foundations of Stone Age life crumbled beneath the relentless pressure of environmental change. The people who depended on these massive creatures for food, shelter, and tools now faced a future where their primary resources were vanishing as surely as winter snow melts before the spring sun. The extinction of the megafauna represented more than just the loss of individual species. It marked the end of entire ways of life that had sustained human communities for thousands of years. Mammoth hunting had required specialized knowledge, sophisticated tools, and complex social organizations that involved dozens of people working together in coordinated teams. When the mammoth herds disappeared, all of this accumulated expertise became useless overnight, forcing communities to completely reinvent their survival strategies. The psychological impact of losing familiar prey animals was enormous, as entire cultural traditions and spiritual practices had been built around relationships with these creatures. Climate change was transforming landscapes with devastating speed, turning familiar hunting grounds into unrecognizable environments where traditional survival techniques no longer worked. Forests were replacing grasslands, wetlands were drying into deserts, and sea levels were rising to flood coastal areas where communities had established themselves for generations. Groups that had developed intimate knowledge of particular ecosystems found themselves displaced into alien territories where their expertise was meaningless. The rate of environmental change often exceeded human ability to adapt, leading to conflicts over remaining resources and territories. The warming temperatures that followed the last ice age created new challenges that were as difficult as the extreme cold that had preceded them. Higher temperatures brought different diseases, altered the behavior of surviving animals, and changed the availability of plant foods that had provided crucial nutrition during lean periods. Groups that had adapted brilliantly to cold conditions now had to learn entirely new skills for surviving in warmer, more humid environments. Insects and parasites that had been controlled by cold weather became serious threats to human health, while new plants and animals moved into changing ecosystems. Population growth became both a blessing and a curse as human communities expanded beyond the carrying capacity of their traditional territories. More people meant greater safety from predators and enemies, but also increased competition for declining resources. Conflicts between neighboring groups intensified as each tribe struggled to secure enough food and territory to sustain their growing numbers. The cooperative relationships that had characterized many Stone Age societies began to break down under the pressure of scarcity and competition, leading to territorial wars and displacement of weaker groups. The transition from hunting and gathering to early forms of agriculture represented a fundamental shift in human relationship with the natural world. Instead of taking what nature provided, people began attempting to control and modify their environment to increase food production. This transition required new tools, new knowledge, and new forms of social organization that were radically different from anything that had existed before. The shift to agriculture was often driven by necessity rather than choice, as traditional food sources became unavailable due to environmental changes and population pressure. Early agricultural experiments were fraught with risks that could lead to starvation if crops failed or pests destroyed harvests. Communities that abandoned hunting and gathering in favor of farming were completely dependent on their ability to successfully grow food, with no backup systems available if their agricultural efforts failed. Many groups faced catastrophic hunger during the learning process as they gradually developed the skills needed for successful cultivation. The trial and error nature of early agriculture meant that many promising communities simply vanished when their experiments failed during critical periods. The domestication of animals created new relationships between humans and other species that fundamentally altered both partners in the arrangement. Wild animals that had once been hunted became livestock that required daily care, feeding, and protection. This shift demanded new knowledge about animal behavior, breeding, and healthcare that took generations to develop through trial and error experimentation. The close contact between humans and domestic animals also introduced new diseases that could spread rapidly through human populations that had no previous exposure or immunity. Settlement patterns changed dramatically as agricultural communities established permanent villages that could support much larger populations than mobile hunting and gathering groups. These larger settlements created new social dynamics, including craft specialization, trade relationships, and hierarchical organizations that were impossible in smaller, more egalitarian groups. The development of social stratification brought benefits in terms of efficiency and organization, but also created new forms of inequality and conflict that have been rare in hunting and gathering societies. Storage technologies became crucial for agricultural societies that needed to preserve surplus food for times when crops failed or seasonal availability was limited. The development of pottery, granaries, and other storage systems allowed communities to survive temporary shortages, but also created wealth disparities between successful and unsuccessful families. Competition for stored resources could lead to conflicts that had been rare in hunting and gathering societies, where immediate consumption of available food was the normal pattern. Disease became a more serious threat as larger, more permanent settlements created ideal conditions for the spread of infectious illnesses. Close contact with domesticated animals introduced new pathogens that could devastate human populations that had no immunity to these diseases. The higher population densities of agricultural villages allowed diseases to spread more rapidly and affect more people than had been possible in smaller, more mobile groups. Epidemics could wipe out entire communities that had no understanding of disease transmission or effective treatments. The psychological adjustments required for the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture were enormous and sometimes traumatic. People who had lived their entire lives in close contact with wild nature found themselves increasingly separated from the natural world by the demands of farming and village life. The loss of intimate knowledge about wild plants and animals represented a severing of connections that had defined human identity for thousands of years, creating psychological stress that manifested in new forms of anxiety and social tension. Environmental degradation began to appear as human activities started to have noticeable impacts on local ecosystems. Deforestation, soil erosion, and overgrazing damaged the land's ability to support both human and animal populations. Communities that had always viewed themselves as part of the natural world suddenly found themselves in conflict with environmental systems that could no longer sustain their activities. The long-term consequences of these early environmental impacts would not become apparent for generations, but the seeds of future ecological crises were being planted during this crucial transition period in human history. Chapter 16, What Cavemen Gave Us. As the last embers of our journey through Stone Age life fade into glowing ash, we find ourselves sitting in the gentle darkness of our modern world, surrounded by technologies and comforts that would seem like magic to our ancient ancestors. Yet every breath we take, every thought we think, every relationship we cherish carries within it the DNA of decisions made around flickering fires tens of thousands of years ago. The genetic inheritance flowing through our veins was shaped by the choices, adaptations, and innovations of those remarkable people who survived when survival was never guaranteed. The human brain that allows you to read these words, to process complex ideas, and to envision distant times and places was forged in the crucible of Stone Age challenges. Every neural pathway, every cognitive ability, every aspect of human intelligence evolved under the relentless pressure of environments where thinking quickly and accurately meant the difference between life and death. Our capacity for pattern recognition, problem solving, and social cooperation all bear the fingerprints of ancestors who had to outwit predators, track prey, and navigate complex social relationships without the luxury of second chances. Modern tools, no matter how sophisticated they may appear, are direct descendants of the first carefully shaped stones that our ancestors used to cut, scrape, and hunt. The smartphone in your pocket, the computer on your desk, the car in your driveway, all represent evolutionary developments from the fundamental principle of using crafted objects to extend human capabilities. The patience, precision, and systematic thinking required for Stone Age toolmaking established the foundation for every technological advance that followed. The same cognitive processes that enabled ancient craftsmen to visualize and create complex stone implements now drive modern engineering, manufacturing, and technological innovation. Language itself, that most human of all abilities, emerged from the communication needs of Stone Age communities. Every word you speak, every story you tell, every joke you share traces its ancestry back to those first meaningful sounds that helped hunting parties coordinate their activities and families share their experiences. The grammar, vocabulary, and expressive power of modern languages all evolve from the basic need to convey complex information accurately and efficiently in life or death situations. The narrative structures we use in literature, film, and everyday conversation still follow patterns that were established around Stone Age campfires when storytelling was essential for preserving survival knowledge. Social cooperation, the foundation of every successful human community, was perfected by Stone Age groups who understood that individual survival depended absolutely on group success. The ability to work together, share resources, resolve conflicts peacefully, and maintain relationships across time and distance. These skills that modern society depends upon were developed by people who knew that banishment from the group meant certain death. The psychological mechanisms that enable trust, empathy, and altruism were refined through countless generations of people who had to balance individual needs with group survival. Art and creativity, those aspects of human nature that seem to serve no practical survival function, actually played crucial roles in Stone Age life by providing means for expressing complex ideas, preserving cultural knowledge, and maintaining group cohesion during difficult times. Every painting, sculpture, song, or story created today continues the tradition of human artistic expression that began when our ancestors first mixed pigments and painted images on cave walls by flickering torchlight. The aesthetic sensibilities that guide modern art, the emotional responses to beauty and creativity, and the human need for self-expression all originated in the caves and campsites of our Stone Age ancestors. Medical knowledge that saves millions of lives today has roots that extend back to Stone Age healers who discovered the medicinal properties of plants through careful observation and dangerous experimentation. Many modern pharmaceuticals are refined versions of compounds that were first identified by people who had no choice but to understand the healing and harmful properties of everything in their environment. The holistic approach to health that considers psychological and social factors alongside physical symptoms reflects ancient understanding of human well-being that modern medicine is only beginning to fully appreciate. The agricultural systems that feed billions of people worldwide evolved from the first tentative experiments conducted by Stone Age groups who began cultivating wild plants and domesticating animals. Every crop, every farming technique, every method of food storage and preservation represents the culmination of innovations that began when our ancestors started trying to control their food supply rather than simply hunting and gathering what nature provided. The selective breeding programs that created modern livestock and crop varieties are direct continuations of processes that began in Stone Age settlements. Urban planning principles that guide the development of modern cities reflect organizational concepts that were first developed by Stone Age communities as they learned to arrange living spaces for maximum efficiency, safety, and social harmony. The understanding of how to balance individual needs with group requirements, how to manage shared resources, and how to maintain order without stifling innovation all have their origins in those first human settlements where survival depended on successful cooperation among diverse individuals. Environmental awareness, which has become crucial for the survival of modern civilization, was an integral part of Stone Age life when people understood intimately that human welfare depended on maintaining healthy relationships with natural systems. The ecological knowledge that our ancestors possessed, understanding of animal behavior, plant cycles, weather patterns, and environmental balance, provides essential insights for addressing contemporary environmental challenges. Their sustainable practices and resource management techniques offer models for modern conservation efforts and sustainable development programs. The resilience and adaptability that allowed Stone Age people to survive ice ages, climate changes, and environmental catastrophes remain essential human qualities that help modern individuals and communities cope with stress, uncertainty, and rapid change. The psychological toughness, flexible thinking, and determined optimism that characterized our ancestors continue to serve us well in facing contemporary challenges. The same mental qualities that enabled them to survive when their world was literally freezing around them now help modern people adapt to technological change, economic uncertainty, and social transformation. Perhaps most importantly, Stone Age people developed the fundamental understanding that human survival depends not on dominating nature, but on finding sustainable ways to live within natural systems. Their wisdom about the need for balance, conservation, and respect for the forces that sustain life becomes more relevant with each passing day as modern civilization grapples with the consequences of forgetting these ancient lessons. The indigenous knowledge systems that preserve Stone Age understanding of ecological relationships offer crucial guidance for creating sustainable futures that honor both human needs and environmental integrity. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you the knowledge that you are the living legacy of countless generations of remarkable people who faced impossible odds and never gave up. Their courage flows in your blood, their intelligence shapes your thoughts, and their love for life and hope for the future lives on in every breath you take. Rest well, knowing that you are part of an unbroken chain of human survival that stretches back through the mists of time to those first flickering fires that separated humanity from the darkness.